Okay, in this submodule, we'll be talking about requirements. Okay, we have to obviously first define what a requirement is, then we'll dive into different types of requirements. Okay, now let's start with a definition of what a requirement is. I mean, the literal meaning of a requirement is as given in the Webster Dictionary. It's something required, something wanted, something needed. When we look at the BABUK, or Business Analysis Body of Knowledge, remember the first lecture we talked about the term need, a problem, opportunity to be addressed, and the requirement is rather a kind of what they call a usable representation of a need. I would say a requirement is an engineered need. I mean, it's a need that can be understood, that's put in such a way that it can be understood by the intended audience of that requirement. When we look at from the perspective of an IT system or a software system, we can see some important definition. First of all, as given by Robertson, requirement is defined as something that the product must do or a quality that it must have. It's a nice definition, but this one from Somerville, I think, is much more complete, and I like this definition much better. But again, now when we talk about a requirement, we're talking about, I mean, these definitions assumes, or you're looking at a requirement from the perspective of an IT system, so an IT system requirement, not a business requirement. IT system requirement, let's put it that way. Okay, a requirement is a description of how the system should behave, right? What properties or attributes the system should have, quality attributes we'll say, and what constraints are applicable on the development process of that system. Again, from systems perspective, what does this system do? How should it behave? What type of attributes, properties do we want it to have? And what kind of constraints available even for the development process of that particular system? Okay, so let's talk about examples of requirements, because all these definitions might be a little bit philosophical. We have to look at some examples to make it clear to everyone. So, example of a library system. So this is rather long. System shall maintain records of all library materials, including books, serials, newspapers, and so on and so forth. The system shall allow users to search for an item by title, author, and ISBN. So it defines how a system should behave. And that kind of a system, essentially, that kind of a requirement, essentially, is it's not black and white, but we may call this type of requirement as a user requirement. It's a function requirement, something that a user can easily understand and can associate himself or herself with. Okay, so we're talking about a user, in this case, a user of a library system, and once a user of the library system reads that sentence, he or she can be able to understand, it will be able to understand whether this is right or wrong, and so on. So it will be able to validate. The system shall be a web-based application. Is that a requirement? Yes, it is. What kind of a requirement? We'll see it about types, but I'm just giving examples. So it's a designer implementation constraint. So it constrains how we want that system, what properties it should have. Essentially, it should be a web-based application instead of, mobile applications, for instance, or you can also say that. Another example, the system shall support at least 20 transactions per second. So it's not about what system should do, but it's mainly about how well that system should behave in that sense. So it's a different type of a requirement. It's a property that we want that system to have. And we call those kind of requirements, it's a performance requirement, the specific one, but a performance requirement is essentially a quality requirement. What else? The library administrators shall be able to use all the system functions after 4 hours of training, and after this training, the average number of errors made by experienced users should not exceed 2 per hour of system use in the first 2 weeks of use. So that is quite I would say, a complete requirement. And we'll see that we have to come up with such complete requirements because it's very important to validate them, verify them. And in this particular example, the statements, or two statements in this case, are good examples of a usability requirement. Again, it's another kind of a quality requirement. So these are the types from we might say that they're more or less at the same level of granularity, but it doesn't always, I mean, the requirements, they don't have to be at the same level of granularity. Check this one out. Patient management system. So we may come up with a stakeholder user requirement and say a patient management system, or hospital information system if you like, shall generate monthly management reports showing the cost of drugs prescribed by each clinic during that month. Fine. So that might make sense for a user, but we might need to come up with something a little bit more specific, more detailed, if we want that system to be built based on our own tastes, let's say, or based on our own constraints, wishes. So I mean, that particular requirement might be understood, so it's intended for users to understand. That's fine, but if we have to come up with something that's intended for the designers, for the programmers, then that might not be enough. So we need to go or dig down into the details and specify a little bit more about what the system should do. So in this case, we, for instance, for defining how the system should behave in detail, we have functional requirements, or sometimes also it's called solution requirements. And for that particular one stakeholder statement or stakeholder requirement statement, you might need to generate more functional requirement statements that exactly tell what the designers or what the programmers should really code and implement. So that's the reason. So we're talking about different granularity levels now. So for instance, on the last working day of each month, a summary of the drugs prescribed, their costs in the prescribing clinics shall be generated, and so on and so forth. So quite detailed representation of how that particular report should be generated, when it's generated, what kind of information it should have, and so on. Granular. So, okay, let's talk about different types of requirements. We can identify, in fact, we can categorize the requirements in terms of granularity into three different types. The first, highest level, represent the business requirements. The stakeholder requirements are in the middle, or user requirements, and we have the let's say solution requirements, systems or solution requirements at the bottom. Let's start with the business requirements. Okay, these are basically high-level business objectives that the organization, the customer of that particular system, which procures the system, that describes why that particular organization really need that thing. What objectives do they have from that particular system? What benefits they would expect from implementing such a system. So it's a high-level representation of the business objectives of a particular organization or a customer that would like to have that particular system. Okay, that is what a business requirement is. Business rules, and by the way, you will have definitions of these things in the handout in additional slides. So I'm not going to show you here, but you will see them in the handouts. Business rule. So, okay, it can be any kind of a policy, or regulation, laws, or some sort of procedures or standards that the organization would like to adhere to. That defines or constrains some aspects of business. Okay, so they're not per se a software or an IT requirement, but they act as an origin of a lot of requirements, starting with the business requirements. Okay, and in fact, we see that business requirements also embedding or based on also on business rules, they are basically recorded in a vision and a scope document. In fact, that's your assignment A. Next are the stakeholder and user requirements. Basically, they define a goal or a task that a specific class of a user must be able to perform with that particular system. Okay, so it describes what the users will be able to do with the system. Like use cases, scenarios, or user stories are nice tools to represent and also elicit that kind of requirements. We have the quality requirements, and by the way, stakeholder user requirements are also kind of influenced, if you like the quality requirements that we'll discuss. They're all influenced by business rules. Business rules are kind of overarching representations or specifications that our system must adhere to. Quality requirements. It's a kind of non-functional requirements, what we say. So we'll see about function requirements, and these are usually called non-functional requirements, but essentially they are just one type of a non-functional requirement, and they describes indicates how well a particular functionality or how well the system performs some behavior. Okay, so I mean characteristics including, for instance, stability, user friendliness or usability, reliability, performance, maintainability, security, integrity. All these kind of what we call abilities are all topics of or different subtypes of quality requirements, where in fact essentially we have a dedicated lecture or a module on quality requirements because they're quite important and it's quite a lot of types we can define. We see that the stakeholder user requirements and sometimes also quality requirements, but not necessarily, are represented, or let's say stored in a stakeholder user requirements document. Okay, so use cases, for instance, you would also see them here as a representation of stakeholder or user requirements. Okay, so we don't have any specific assignment for that. So we just have assignment A, vision and scope document, and then we'll see we have assignment C, which is the lowest level of granularity. Function requirements. So function requirement describes a behavior that a software product must exhibit under specific conditions. Okay, so it typically defines the inputs and outputs and what the system should do to get to an output, to produce that output using the inputs that has been given to it. Closely related topic with the function requirements are the, let's say, about the data that the system will manipulate. So you usually see them kind of hand in hand, if you like. It's definitely required to specify the essential subject or business objects, what sometimes we call like entities or like classes that would be relevant for the system, that the system will manipulate through functions, through some kind of through functions basically. We'll see examples. System requirements. Sometimes we define very large systems or requirements for very large systems, and if this is the case, we might need to first go through very high-level function requirements and do some kind of architecture of this very large system, and we define high-level function requirements for large system components. Okay, so think about an airline or air traffic control management system or a nuclear power control system. Such a huge system is made up of several large components. In this case, we have to come up with an architecture of the entire system, and we say, okay, now this is that component, this is that component, this component does this, and this component does that. Those high-level specifications of requirements, function requirements, we call them system requirements, and then we take them and we dig down, we make them a little bit more, let's say, specific, detailed, sufficient enough for the designers and coders to understand. These are system requirements. Function requirements are also influenced by business rules, by the way, and quality requirements. Sometimes they just they are translated into function requirements, like sometimes security requirements are of that kind. External interface requirements. So basically these days, particularly, you can't think of any kind of a software system that does not interact with its environment. So it's extremely important to define what kind of information that particular system will exchange with its outer world, with other type of systems, with the users first of all, through user interfaces, and with software interfaces, what kind of information. If you're talking about an ERP system, that it communicates with other type of ERP systems of a supplier or your CRM system, and so on. So you define the software, the user, or let's start with the user. The user interface requirements, software interface requirements, and also hardware interface requirements. If you're talking about a hardware or software intensive system, component hardware system like this one, that's a embedded system, if you like. So there's this hardware here, and there's also software inside of it. So that you need to also define how this particular system, this particular software inside this one communicates with the other sensors and so on. That's an external interface requirement. User, software, or interface with the user, with other software, and with the hardware. Constraints. Basically, these are restrictions that are imposed on the choices available, particularly to the developer, for the design and implementation, construction or development of a particular product. Okay? So we're talking about, for instance, whether it's a web-based application, whether it's a software application, what type of standards you should follow in defining the requirements, or what. I mean, you can also define as a requirement that something that guides the programmers. You might say, hey, I mean, this software should be developed using, I don't know, Python, for instance, because I have an existing Python system that you need to integrate. Or you might say it should use this particular database system, Oracle database system, because I already have an Oracle database system in my other software, so I don't want yet another one, or yet another kind of a brand, if you like. Constraints. All these kind of functional requirements, quality requirements, some quality requirements, external interface requirements that are not directly translated into functional requirements, and constraints, they go into the what we call requirement specification document, or a requirements management tool, if you like, in the form of solution requirements. Solution requirements basically is a kind of combined term, a unified requirement statement. It's a higher order category, which when we want to refer to the function requirement, external interface, quality requirements, and constraints. Or let's say solution requirements are basically those requirements that are targeted at the developer, the designer, to the, let's say, later phases of the development. User requirements are for the users, and business requirements are mainly for the business. Okay, so this is in fact basically the reason why we have three levels. So first, we address the business. We make sure that we understand the same thing, and then we speak with the users and try to validate whether they really, what we specify is exactly what they need, or what they can agree with. And later on, given all these requirements, we define solution requirements, functional, external constraints, and so on, to guide the further development of the software system. And we target there the designers and the programmers, okay, and the testers there. Okay, so these are the types of requirements, and we'll come back to these types of requirements essentially later on, also in this course. Yeah, that's it for this particular module in this case, and see you in other ones.